My name is Greg Dunlap. I would like to thank the Drupal Dev Days organizers from having me here in your fair city of Barcelona. It's been lovely. We were out on the beach until 1 o'clock in the morning last night, and my shoes are wet and full of sand. So that was a lot of fun. And I'd also like to thank Acquia specifically, who funded my travel costs to come here from the US and stay and code sprint with people this week and talk to you about the Drupal 8 configuration management system. I'm Hayrocker on Twitter and all of the other websites in the world, and I live in Portland, Oregon, and I contract and play a lot of pinball. So the Drupal 8 configuration management system. So what is it? So in 2007 or so, I started getting involved in Drupal, and one of the things that I discovered after we launched our first website on Drupal is that launching a website on Drupal is really easy, but launching more stuff onto that website with Drupal after you've already built it is very hard. And some of the difficulties, which I'm sure many of the people in this audience are aware of, are the fact that configuration in Drupal is stored in a wide variety of different places and different formats. And sometimes it's exportable, and sometimes it's not, and sometimes it's spread across 5 different tables, and sometimes it's in variables, and all of this kind of thing. And we don't have any standard way to store configuration. And the other problem is that we don't have a way to separate the configuration from the content, so that when you launch a site, you start getting comments and forum postings and user-generated content of all different kinds. It's impossible to push your changes to the new site without wiping away all of that stuff, are very difficult. And so it makes deploying new functionality into the site much harder than it needs to be. Over the years, a lot of solutions have come up to that problem. I wrote a module in 2008 or so called Deploy, which did content deployment between sites. And then, of course, the features module has come out, and CTools exportables and all of these things. But they're all still kind of hobbled by the fact that they don't, there is no standardized configuration system in Drupal core. Features, almost all of the code in features is for features writing a set of code to export and import very specific things within Drupal, like the users and permissions system. It's a one-off storage format for users and permissions. It has nothing in common with anything else. So they've got to write a little chunk of code over here to handle that, and a chunk of code over here to handle taxonomies, and a chunk of code over here to handle whatever else. And then individual modules have to write chunks of code to handle their stuff. And then you've got to support the CTools exportables and all of these things. And so what we really need is a central API to manage all this configuration. And so at DrupalCon Chicago, I talked to Dries about doing this, and he appointed me initiative lead to run the configuration management initiative for Drupal 8. And all that really means is that I'm responsible for herding cats and getting people together to help architect the system and oversee the process and make sure that everything gets done. So that's what we've been building. We started at a code sprint at Drupal Camp Denver about a year ago. It was myself and Angie Byron and Chex and David Strauss and Larry Garfield. And we architected the first version of the system. It iterated for a long time. A lot of that work was sponsored by Node 1, who I was working for at the time, who had generously donated me 50% of my working time to help build the system. And through all of that, we got our first patch in, which implemented the system. And since then, we've been expanding on it and doing conversions of Drupal 8 functionality to this system for settings, forms, and replacing variables and this sort of thing, and learning a lot about how the system works and what we designed properly and what we didn't, and iterating and re-architecting and stuff like that. So this session is going to be some talk about how the system is architected, how you would work with it as module developers, and some of the things that aren't in the system that will hopefully be coming down the pipe as we head into Drupal 8. So, how does this configuration system work? The configuration management system has sort of a 3-layer architecture. So the first part is that configuration is in files. These files are stored in a specially named directory in your defaults files directory. The files are machine readable. Right now they're YAML. Is the format that they're in, and they contain all of the information that can be used to configure a specific set of data. So this is an example YAML file for an image for the default Drupal core large image style. You can see it's got a name and then an effects array, and then a list of all the effects and the data for those effects and things like that. This is just a YAML representation of a PHP array, really, is what it comes down to. The file is shipped with the image module, and then when the image module is installed, that file is copied to your site's live directory, where all of your live configuration is held. But the original copy stays with your module, which means that we always have the original copy in case you ever want to revert your settings back to the module's defaults. In the live image directory, all of your files exist and will be able to be moved around, checked into Git, diffed with each other, and moved around from site to site and reloaded on each site. Now, when the files are when you take a file and load it into and reload it into your site or whatever, it's loaded into what is called the active store. The active store is a database table, although it has pluggable storage format, so it doesn't have to be the database, that holds the data from your files. And that is where the active store is where data is read from on a day-to-day basis. There were some really good reasons to have this sort of 2-layered approach. When we first wrote the system, we had everything reading and writing directly to the files, which made a lot of sense at first. But as we designed the system more and more, it seemed to make a lot more sense to have a sort of 2-layer storage system for a lot of reasons. One is that when you're reading and writing directly from your files, if you've got a syntax error in one of those files, it can take your site down, basically. But if you have to actually load from the files into a separate storage system, you can prevent that from happening. You may still have a syntax error in your file and the load may fail, but you've still got this separate storage system that's always known to be good and keep your site running. Another good reason to do this is that while YAML is really good for the files on disk because it's readable and easy to create and write, it's not necessarily good for what we're doing day to day on the sites because it has to be, because in order to get it to PHP, it has to be parsed and expanded and things like this. But in the secondary storage, we can just store raw PHP arrays because that's fast and much easier for the code to deal with. So the stuff that we read from day to day and the stuff that's on the file system for developers have different needs and different priorities. You've got files on the disk that are YAML. They get loaded into your site and held in the active store. As your system reads configuration throughout the day, that stuff is read from the active store, and when changes are saved, they're saved back to the active store and back to the files. So your files are always in sync with the active store, and the files always represent a current status of the configuration of your site. So that's the storage part, and then you interact, of course, with the configuration system through a new API that we've developed. And this is what I'm going to start showing you some code here. So there's a new function called config, and when you call it, you pass it the name of a file that you want to read configuration out of. The file names are namespaced. So the first part of the file, in this case, you can see we have config image style large.yaml. And so the first part of the file name is always going to be the module that owns it. So the files are namespaced by module. And then the rest of it is sort of going to be module dependent. So for instance, image.style. The name of the image style in this case. Once you do that, you get a config object, and the config object has several functions on it that you can use to get and set data. So for instance, in this case, you can see we have config get name, and that would return the value of the name element, which in this case would be large. So that's a very simple example of how you would get data out of the new configuration management system. You can also, but you can also get data from not just scalar data, but arrays. So for instance, in this case, when I do config get effects, I'm getting the value of the effects key here. So, and that's an array, and so I would get an array that contains all of the image effects. You can also dive deep down into the data to get data at any level, and you do that by separating every nested key with a dot or a period. And so, for instance, in this case, I'm saying effects.image scale 480 481 data, and then it will give me the array with width, height, and upscale. And so when you're retrieving data from the configuration system, that's pretty much how it does. How it's done. It's pretty simple. It's similar to the variable system in some ways because you still have to know the unique key that you're grabbing to identify the configuration, but it has a lot of benefits on top of it, of course. Now, when you want to save, you do the same thing. You get a config object. In this case, we're getting the system performance settings, and you call config set. And what you set is the name of the key that you're setting and the value that you're setting into it. So if this was in a form submit handler, you would say, I want to take the form state values from my cache setting and set it back into my data thing. You can set any number of data keys that you want, and then you call save, and it writes it back to the Aptus store and the files. That's pretty much it. It's that simple. And just like with the get functionality, you can save whole arrays of data into it, or you can save to any nesting level that you want. One thing that I should point out here is that if you're familiar with the current variable system, you know that when you get a value, you also specify a default for that value. In case the value doesn't exist anymore, we have removed that functionality from this system. Modules that provide data through the configuration management system have to explicitly define it and define a default when the module is provided. And that will actually help solve a lot of bugs that crop up in systems, because what happens is that when you need to get configuration from a bunch of different places, these defaults tend to diverge, and they're hard to keep together and the same across all of this. And so it's actually a really good thing for coding and keeping coding straight, even though at first a lot of people think it's kind of a little bit more of a pain because your data has to be more specified up front. So back to this. Does anybody have any questions yet? You may end up with hundreds, or yes, you'll end up with a very large number of files in the end, yes. There's some discussion going on. He was asking the files are namespaced, will you end up with a very large number of files in the end? And the answer is probably yes. And there's been some discussion about how much data should be stored in each file, because on the one hand, it makes sense to group data together. And while we don't want one gigantic file with everything in it, we also don't want one file per piece of data either. And so we need some way to group the data to a somewhat granular level, but not too granular. And so there's been a lot of discussion about how to organize the files. But that discussion is ongoing, and you will end up with a lot of files in the end. Yeah. So the last step, of course, is that you will import and export to deploy. Um, I said earlier that when you save, your data is saved into the active store and directly to the files. And that's actually somewhat under discussion right now, but for now that's true. So you don't have to export your files. Your files are always there on the file system. Then you can just move them between any of your sites that you want, and there will be a button in your administration screen or a drush command or all sorts of different ways to do this that allows you to say, I want to import my existing files from the site back into my system. And you'll press the button, and it'll give you a list, and it'll say, well, here are all the new files that are in your system. Here are the files that have been changed. And here are the files that used to be in your system that are now gone. And given all of this, do you want to proceed with this import operation, yes or no? And you'll say yes or no. And what will happen is that a process is set off that goes through your module list in a very carefully defined order to avoid breaking out your dependencies, because there are a lot of weird dependencies in this system. Because, for instance, if you think about the field system, you may have a configuration file that defines a new content type, and then defines new field types, and then defines new instances of those field types on the content type. And you don't want to create the content type and the instances of the field type without creating the new field types themselves. That will break everything. So there's a very complex dependency chain that has to be sorted out. And then every module has the option to look at the current state of config and the old state of config and say, is there anything that I need to act on when this import process is taking place? And they say yes or no, and they do their thing, and then it passes on to the next one, and the import takes place, and then all of your new configuration is loaded. That's sort of the key to all of this, is that when your configuration is in files, you can always just move it to your new site and load it up and be done. Ideally, when we are finished, we're not providing a lot of detailed functionality in terms that people will want in terms of being able to diff these files or only load this file or that file. But I suspect that modules like features and other contrib modules will start adding that information. And what will really happen, I think, down the road is that features module will just sort of become a UI around the configuration system, which those guys are really happy about because it means that they get to throw like 3/4 of their code away. That's really the basics of the system. It's very simple to use. Functionality-wise, it's not that much different from the variable system we have in terms of the developer experience, but under the hood, it provides us a ton more functionality and flexibility than that system did. So that's the basics of the system. However, there's still some stuff that we're talking about and working on that's upcoming that we can discuss and that I'll tell you about. Some of it's exciting, some of it's sort of implementation details, but there's some good things coming. One is that we haven't figured out an implementation of the old system settings form functionality to work with this new system. One of the things about the old variable system is that it only had one key. All you had to know was the name of the data that you had. In the new system, we actually have to know about the name of the data and where it's stored and what file it's stored. And that offers an additional level of complexity that we haven't completely sorted out in order to make system settings form run. But there's a proposal on the table which adds some sort of data binding to Form API that allows you to specify the location of where your data is stored. And in some cases, it's really easy because you'll have a bunch of settings on a form and they'll all get saved into one file. But in some cases, it's really difficult because you'll have a bunch of settings on a form and then 5 modules will alter new settings into that form, and all of that data has to be stored in different places. So we're working on getting some more data awareness into Form API, and that's and there's an issue about implementing system settings form in the new system and making all of that work. And we plan on having that done before Drupal 8 ships. What's overridden? And so when I was at DrupalCon Chicago and I was giving a status report on the configuration management initiative, a guy came up and asked me, so in your system, how do I know that the data that I'm importing doesn't overwrite the changes that my clients are making on the live site. And I said, you don't let your clients make changes on the live site. And he said, well, that's not really a reality in my situation because they have to make changes on the live site. And I said, well, the whole reason that your clients have to make changes on the live site now is because it's impossible to put together the kind of workflow that would allow them to easily do changes on a dev site and move them into the live site. If you had that kind of a workflow, you wouldn't need to do the kind of things that we need to do today. And he said, well, that's not really true. And we went back and forth about it. And then he posted a blog post, and we went back and forth about it there. And but what came out of a lot of those discussions is that a lot of people want this ability to tell whether the stuff that was loaded since the last time has been modified since that load. And so we're talking about the ability to not only be able to import and export, but to show which of the things have been overridden since the last export. So when you import, so at the time that you import, you would not only see stuff that's changed from the files and the current state of the site, but you could also say what's changed from the current state of the site since the last time that you actually reloaded your configuration. And that would allow you to sort of do these comparisons where I've got something new in the files and I've got something that's new on the live site also. This is a conflict. What do you want to do about it? There's an issue around that. There's no code, but there's a proposal for an architecture to make that work. I would be surprised if we didn't end up doing this for Drupal 8. I know that in particular Earl is quite keen to have this functionality in Drupal 8 because he has it now in views and people like it a lot. So I think we'll probably get that in at some point or another. Internationalization. So right now the code that's in the configuration system is not multilingual aware, and the text that's in the configuration system is not translatable. We've had a lot of talk about this, me and Gabor and lots of other people over the years, and it seems like every time we would get a bunch of people together, we would spin our wheels and try and figure out ways that we were going to implement this and not come up with a lot of great ideas or come up with conflicting ideas and things like this. It's a very complicated problem space because in configuration, there's a difference between stuff that's translatable and stuff that's we're calling it multilingual. So for instance, your site name is translatable. If you've got a site name, you want to translate it, the actual text of your site name from the language specific versions of your site. However, your default site front page, you may want it to be different on all of your sites, all of your language-specific sites, but it's not translated to a new language. It's just different. And so there's sort of two levels of functionality that have to happen there. We've had two now big discussions about that this week with me and Gabor and Jose Rayero and Sun and Jess and Angie and all sorts of people going back and forth on this internationalization issue. And we think that we have come up with a solution for it finally. And that leads me to my next slide, which is a context system. And so the idea is that we should be able to contextually change configuration. And language is just one of those potential contexts. And so what we're talking about putting together now, and this was proposed by Jose Rayero, is a system by which you can write context plugins that allow you to dynamically change configuration depending on whatever you really want to depend on. And so, for instance, if you want to have a different set of configuration for a specific language, you can write a language plugin that manages that. But if you want to have a different set of configuration depending on what domain name you're on, like domain access module would do, you can do that as well. If you want to have a different set of configuration based on whether it's between 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning, you can do that, you know. It will allow a lot of really wide-ranging and flexible functionality that I think people will get a lot of use out of. I had resisted it for a long time because it adds some architectural complexity to the system that I wasn't necessarily prepared to take on. And also, since each one of these individual contexts will essentially have its own complete set of files. It really ratchets up the number of files that'll be on your system by quite a bit. But on the other hand, for the vast majority of Drupal websites out there, it's not going to make that much of a difference. And having everything in separate files is actually helpful because it allows people to, for instance, say, I only want to push the Spanish versions of my site or the German version of my site or whatever. Whereas if our original proposal had all of that language-specific data within one single file, which wouldn't have allowed that separation. And so I think it's going to be a good system. So keep an eye out on that. I'm sure there will be blog posts and things like that resulting from this discussion this week on Drupal Planet and whatever. Another thing we're talking about is sort of a alternative storage structure, which is that right now we store the data from the configuration system from the files in blobs in MySQL. They're just great big text blobs of serialized PHP. Justin Randall, who is Bejeebus on IRC, has put together a proposal in which we actually store that in a much more sort of key value way in the database so that you actually break those blobs out into their individual keys in the database, which would make them quicker to access, but it would also make generating and saving the files much more complicated. And so that's something we're talking about. I don't know if that's actually going to happen, but there are some pros and cons to that discussion that are interesting. Another thing that came up this week is sort of more formalizing the architecture around how we save things, because we actually have a lot of places that we not necessarily need to write from, but definitely that we need to read configuration from. And so there's going to be some changes around the storage architecture. They won't change anything about how people actually interact with the system at all, though. And lastly, as a community effort, we love for people to get involved in helping out and helping us grow and build the system. Originally, I had really hoped that when the initial system went in, we would be able to set up a huge pile of issues that were convert this to configuration management system and convert this to configuration management system and convert this to configuration management system. And so at DrupalCon Denver, before the code sprint, I made about 30 of these issues for new contributors to work on. And as we started working on those implementations, we discovered that there's a lot of complexity around all of them. And it's sort of like one of those things where it's like, oh, I'm going to convert the site information to the configuration management system. Oh, this is easy. Oh, except sometimes we need this stuff in the site information in the installer before the database is available, so now what are we going to do? And all of these kinds of things. And it's like every time we started to implement one of those, it was like when you have a little thread hanging off your sweater and you start pulling on it, and the next thing you know, your whole sweater's on the floor. And so those issues continue to get worked out. They're not necessarily easy, but there's a lot of them, and we could use a ton of help from experienced developers. And so here is some places where you can get involved. Groups.drupal.org/CMI is where all of the high-scale discussion happens for stuff that's happening for the Configuration Management Initiative. This short URL is a way to get to the issue list of issues tagged configuration system, which is the tag that we're using for these issues. Groups.drupal.org/core is for generalized core announcements, and that's where a lot of announcements about functionality that has been committed will go, big chunks of functionality. Every other week I hold discussion and update meetings on Pound Drupal-CMI. Those are on Tuesdays, and they are in the evening in Europe. I think they would be at 9 o'clock in the evening local time. On Freenode, of course. XJM runs core mentoring hours every week. So if you're a new Drupal contributor and you want to get involved in core, that's a great place to sort of get your feet wet and get introduced to the core process. and so that you can move on to doing more complicated things. Because a lot of people are like, I really want to get involved in core, but it's a little intimidating, and it is totally intimidating. I was involved in Drupal for 5 years before I started getting involved in core seriously. But these guys do a great job of helping to bring people into the fold and find them stuff to do that they can get a lot of success with. Zendoodles on IRC also runs core wind sprints, which are similar to the core mentoring hours in that they find a group of issues around a core initiative and attack them basically for a couple hours a week. And so if you want to get involved, these are the great places to get involved, find issues, help out with them. One of the things that has been really important for the system is that we get a ton of community feedback so that we can make sure that everybody's on board, that everybody's use cases are allowed, and so that everything is up to what people expect out of core. And now I will open the floor to your questions. We have a mic here that I can use so that the questions actually get recorded on the video. There we go. And so ask your questions.
I was just wondering, during imports, does the site become inactive?
We probably, yes. We don't have it becoming inactive yet, but that's probably going to end up happening, yes. We don't really know how long that process is going to take either. The import patch is probably just about ready to get committed. You actually can't import yet. And so because the import process ended up being much more complicated than we ever expected. And so, but yes, probably, you will probably have to.
The reading and saving, will there be any attempts, to consolidate that so that if you request a certain bit of information and you may make multiple requests across different files, is there going to be any attempt in the saving or reading process to make it just like one query or?
I think for most of that, we're going to focus on educating people about the sort of performance implications of doing certain things. So, for instance, as we've converted systems to core, we've mostly focused on when you need to get a bunch of data from a single place, you get the data once and work with it and then save it and you're done. And so I think we're not going to build anything special into the system to consolidate those things, and I think we're mostly just going to focus on educating developers on what are the right way and wrong way to do things. One thing we are definitely going to do, though, is on the read side, we're probably going to end up static caching everything so that you read it once and then you never have to get it out of the database again. So that'll help a lot on the read side, because right now we actually do have to get everything for every read out of the database, and that's not going to work. So we're building a static caching system around that so that it'll improve performance for there.
And with context, is there going to be inheritance with that?
The context stuff is just a proposal right now, and so do you mean so that you can have multiple contexts, or? Well,
like internationalization, so you'd have a language, and then in some instances you might just want to override specific terms so that the French language becomes
in terms of that, in the context system, you will only be overriding the things that you want to. So while most things will be translatable, the files will only hold the things that are different from the main thing. And so, yeah.
Hello. The variable system was also used to store transient information, which we call state. Does CMI offer a new way to do this or not?
To store, I'm sorry, to store.
State information, things like last run run, things like that.
No, we are not going to put that stuff into CMI. There's another set of issues that are focused on building a state system for Drupal, and it's also talking about implementing a generic sort of key value store system for Drupal. And so you'll be able to find those issues in the queue somewhere. I'm not sure where, but we're specifically trying to avoid putting any state information into the system at all. Anything that you would write that often or need to read or that changes behind the scenes to set state, we're going to not put in the system at all.
Thanks.
I actually have a few questions, if that's okay.
Yeah, and we have, I don't know when we're supposed to end.
Okay, well, I'll try to be quick. So if I understood right, we are introducing universally unique IDs also in core. Could we also use this to kind of stage content?
Yes, and that's the plan actually. So the idea, I was originally supposed to take that on, and I haven't had enough time. Dick Olson, who's working at Al Jazeera right now, is starting to head up that project. And so the idea is that we put universally unique identifiers on all entities, and then you will be able to, and they wouldn't replace the entities keys, they would lay alongside the serial keys. So even though an entity ID may be different on two sites, their UUID would still be the same. And you would be able to use that to stage content. I don't think we're going to build any content staging functionality into core, but my feeling is that as long as we have the APIs that allow you to save content well and the ability to uniquely identify the content, then I'll let Contrib handle that problem. And so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So then, also if I understood right, the files, the configuration files, are stored in public files in some randomly named directory.
Right, right.
Okay. So if I have two sites and I kind of, when is that name defined? That random name defined? I'm looking for version control stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
So could it happen that I have different directory names in one side, in staging one name and in production another name, and then I cannot put it through Git, for example?
The way that it works is that if you go through the default Drupal installation process, it will create a name for you. However, similar to the way that the database settings work, you can, before you start, set your own directory name in the settings.php, and it will use that instead at install time if it sees it.
Okay, so I can define it myself.
Yes, you can define your own. And if you want to, you can also define it outside of webroot so that they won't be public.
Okay. Then the last thing, you said that we need some kind of default values to be able to read the data, but do we have to define it in our model?
Yes.
So, because I tried this system before, of course it's not ready yet, and it was still XML, but I tried to wrote some random stuff and it went there. I didn't have any default values. I think I didn't even have a default file defined, and I just wrote from my model, and it made that file and all the data.
Right. Oh, that's, well, sure. That's if you're writing. That's you can dynamically add stuff. But the thing is, in the old variable system, you could read without ever defining a value, and that won't work. You can't in this system read without having a value previously defined.
Right. Okay. Right. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else?
Hi. So you were saying there's all sorts of interdependencies, and it can get complicated pretty quick.
With the modules for the import system, yeah.
And I was wondering, just in general, do you have a test strategy set up? You know, how do you check the viability of all this beyond waiting for people to say, "Hey, this doesn't work," and so on?
I mean, to some extent, the systems that are complicated enough to need this are few. the field system is definitely one, views will definitely be one, but beyond that, the needs of core are actually reasonably simple. So to some extent, we're really relying on the knowledge of these subsystem maintainers, YCHED in the instance of the field system and Earl in the instance of the view system, to know the level of complexity and what has to be done. But obviously we'll be putting together unit tests in the testing system for all of the import operations and testing all sorts of things like if we define these 8 things, do they go in properly? Do calls happen in the proper order? The dependency chain is something we're still working on. Right now, we're hoping that we can use the dependencies as defined in the module's dependencies in the info files to generate that list, and that will work for us. We haven't tested it enough to know if that's actually going to succeed or not, but that's, right. Or I guess, yeah.
Were you thinking of maybe setting up some example sites that are sufficiently complicated
Yeah.
with...
And we'll be building that, and that's what we'll be building into the testing system as well, to make sure that all of those things are happening properly.
So you showed how the namespacing works, for example, when defining image styles.
Yeah.
And that the example you gave is when the image module defines its own image styles.
Yeah.
How does that work when you have another module that wants to define an image style, and how does that get the separation between the module that defines the components and the module that actually creates components of that type?
It actually works exactly the same way. So if your module wants to supply an image style, then it would create a file that's image.style.whatever. Your module can provide default configuration for other modules, and so you would be able to supply default views the same way, and so. The files are namespaced by the module that the data belongs to, is essentially what it comes down to.
Okay, but then how would the image module know where are image style defined in all those different files that I have? So if every module that defines some kind of configuration can define image styles as part of that, it means that the image module would need to go through all the existing data and look for image styles?
Yeah, essentially, we have a series of functions in the API that are used for querying out, based on namespaces, certain data. And so, for instance, if your module provides, say that your module provides 5 new image styles. When your module is installed, those 5 image styles get loaded into the main config directory and the active store. And they all begin with image.style. And so the image module can then go into that data and say, give me a list of all of the configuration that begins with image.style, and then it gets a list. And so that's how it knows what all image styles are available.
Okay.
Anybody else? Cool. I'll be around all week if you have any more questions or want to get more information about the system. And thanks for coming, and enjoy the rest of Drupal Dev Days.